What happens when Donald Trump is confronted with a shocking, disrespectful question about Melania, live on air? What starts as a simple interview quickly turns into a battle of wits, mind games, and unexpected twists. But here's the real question: who is really in control? Before we dive in, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We bring you the most thought-provoking interviews, political showdowns, and deep dives you won't find anywhere else. The dimly lit room was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the equipment somewhere in the background. Donald Trump sat across from his interviewer, a seasoned journalist known for his sharp wit and unyielding pursuit of truth, or at least what he defined as truth. There were no windows, no clocks on the walls, just an austere table with 2 chairs and a large screen mounted directly ahead. The camera, if there even was one, remained invisible, its presence hinted only by the glowing red light above it. It wasn't clear who, if anyone, was watching. Trump adjusted his tie slightly, glancing around the room with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to unusual situations. His eyes settled back on the man sitting opposite him, whose enigmatic smile seemed almost theatrical. This wasn't going to be a typical interview, that much was already evident. "Mr. Trump," the interviewer began, leaning forward with deliberate intent, "have you ever considered the possibility that everything you've achieved might simply be due to luck rather than genuine talent?" For a moment, the question hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. But Trump didn't flinch. Instead, he arched an eyebrow and responded with the same confident smirk that had become his trademark over decades in the public eye. "If sheer luck could sustain success for more than 50 years, then perhaps I've figured out how to harness fortune itself." His voice carried a tone of playful defiance, but beneath it lay a calculated precision, a reminder that this was still very much a game, and he intended to win. The interviewer's lips curled into a thin line. He hadn't expected such a quick retort, but neither did he intend to let the former president off easily. Pushing further, he shifted his weight forward, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "You don't think you're living in a world where truth doesn't matter anymore?" Trump shrugged nonchalantly, his demeanor unchanged. "Truth always matters. It's just not always told the way it should be." A pause followed, heavy with unspoken implications. The interviewer studied Trump carefully, searching for any sign of vulnerability, any crack in the armor. Yet all he found was the same unwavering confidence that had propelled Trump through countless storms, both personal and political. But the journalist wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. He leaned back in his chair, adopting a more casual posture while masking his growing frustration. "Let me ask you something else, Mr. Trump. If someone wanted to destroy Melania's image, not because they dislike you personally, but as part of a larger strategy to manipulate you, do you think you'd recognize their motives?" This time, Trump hesitated. For the first time since the interview began, his expression faltered ever so slightly. A flicker of curiosity crossed his face before being replaced once again by that familiar grin. "What exactly are you implying?" he asked, his tone now tinged with caution. The interviewer pressed on, undeterred. "There are forces out there that don't want you to succeed, not politically, but in the war for truth. They understand your vulnerabilities better than you might realize." Trump chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I've faced the media my entire life. If someone thinks they can bring me down by distorting Melania's image, they underestimate both of us." It was a bold declaration, delivered with characteristic bravado. And yet, beneath the surface, there was a hint of unease, an acknowledgement that the stakes here were higher than they initially appeared. The interviewer noticed it too, though he chose not to dwell on it just yet. Instead, he decided to pivot, shifting gears abruptly to keep Trump off balance. "What if I told you this interview isn't actually live? That it's merely a psychological experiment designed to test how people react under pressure?" Now Trump raised both eyebrows, clearly intrigued. "I don't believe anything without evidence. But if this is some kind of test, then I'm passing it with flying colors." The interviewer smiled faintly, almost sympathetically. "And what if I revealed that I'm not just a journalist, but part of a research team studying human responses to media manipulation? Would that change your perspective?" Trump crossed his arms, his gaze steady and penetrating. Are you testing me, or are you testing your audience? The question hung between them, a challenge wrapped in rhetoric. Neither man broke eye contact, each sizing up the other in silence. Finally, the interviewer broke the tension with another sly grin. We'll see, he said cryptically, leaving the statement open-ended. As the minutes ticked by, the atmosphere grew increasingly charged. Both men knew this was more than just an interview. It was a battle of wits, a clash of egos, and perhaps most importantly, a test of wills. Who would emerge victorious? Only time, and the unfolding narrative, would tell. The atmosphere in the room shifted subtly as the conversation turned toward Melania. The mention of her name seemed to cast a shadow over the proceedings, an unspoken weight settling between the two men. Trump's demeanor changed slightly. His usual confidence was tempered by a flicker of something else, perhaps concern, or maybe even doubt. Let's talk about Melania, the interviewer began, his voice softer now but no less probing. She's more than just your spouse. In many ways, she represents the face of grace and dignity amidst the chaos you've often thrived in. Trump leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest. For a moment he said nothing, choosing instead to study the journalist across from him. Then, with deliberate care, he responded. Melania has always been a pillar of strength, not just for me, but for our family. She carries herself with class, even when the world tries to tear her down. The interviewer nodded slowly, as if acknowledging this statement before pivoting to a more pointed line of questioning. But what if someone were deliberately targeting her image, not out of personal vendetta, but as part of a larger strategy? A way to get to you? Trump stiffened visibly, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. I don't know who you're implying here, but let me make one thing clear. Anyone who thinks they can hurt me by going after Melania underestimates both of us. We've faced worse, and we'll face it again if necessary. The response was firm, almost defiant, yet there was a brief hesitation, a crack in the armor, that didn't go unnoticed by the interviewer. Sensing an opportunity, he pressed further. And if these attacks came not from traditional sources, but from within the very systems you claim to distrust? What then? This time, Trump hesitated longer, his eyes narrowing as he considered the implications. Systems are only as powerful as the people operating them. If someone inside those systems wants to play games, they'll find themselves playing against someone who knows how to win. The interviewer smiled faintly, leaning forward once more. Winning isn't always about defeating your opponent, Mr. Trump. Sometimes it's about recognizing when you're being played yourself. Trump frowned, clearly irritated by the suggestion. Look, I've dealt with manipulators my entire life. Politicians, media figures, even allies who turned against me. If someone thinks they can outsmart me, they haven't been paying attention. Yet, despite his confident words, there was a lingering unease in the air. The mention of internal threats, of betrayal from unexpected quarters, struck a chord deep within him. It wasn't fear, exactly, but rather a heightened awareness of vulnerabilities he had long kept hidden. The interviewer sensed this shift, and decided to push harder. Imagine a scenario where the lines between truth and fiction blur completely. Where every word spoken about Melania becomes another piece in a larger puzzle designed to destabilize you. How would you react? Trump's expression darkened, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You're testing me, aren't you? Trying to see how far you can push before I break. I'm simply asking questions, the interviewer replied smoothly. Questions that others may not have the courage, or the permission, to ask. For several moments, neither man spoke. The tension in the room grew palpable, each breath seeming louder than the last. Finally, Trump broke the silence, his tone measured but resolute. If this is some kind of psychological warfare, then consider me well prepared. But remember this, wars aren't won by tactics alone. They're won by knowing your enemy, and yourself. The interviewer tilted his head slightly, his smile widening. And what if your greatest enemy turns out to be the mirror? Trump stared at him, unmoving. The question hung in the air like a challenge, forcing him to confront truths he might prefer to leave buried. For the first time since the interview began, he appeared genuinely unsettled. As the minutes stretched on, the dynamic between the two men shifted once again. No longer was it merely a battle of wits, it was a duel of identities, each trying to unravel the other's core beliefs. And at the center of it all stood Melania, a silent yet formidable presence whose role in this game remained unclear. The room remained eerily still as the interviewer's revelation hung in the air like an unspoken truth. Donald Trump sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable, though his sharp eyes betrayed a flicker of curiosity. The journalist watched him closely, gauging his reaction before continuing. "You're right," the interviewer admitted, his voice calm but laced with underlying tension. "This isn't just about testing you, it's also about understanding how people respond to manipulation, especially when they believe they're immune to it." Trump raised an eyebrow, leaning forward slightly. "Immune? I don't claim to be immune to anything. But I do know how to recognize a game when I see one. So tell me, what exactly is this experiment supposed to prove?" The interviewer hesitated for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "It's about power, the kind that shapes perceptions, influences decisions, and ultimately controls outcomes. We're studying how individuals react when confronted with uncertainty, particularly those who pride themselves on certainty." Trump smirked, clearly amused by the notion. "And you think I'm some kind of guinea pig in your little science project? Interesting choice of subject." "Not necessarily," the interviewer countered smoothly. "You're not just any individual. You've built an empire on charisma, confidence, and calculated risk-taking. What we want to understand is whether even someone like you, someone who thrives on chaos, can be swayed by forces beyond your control." Trump leaned back again, crossing his arms as he processed this information. For a moment, he said nothing, allowing the gravity of the situation to sink in. Then, with a wry smile, he responded. "If that's the case, then congratulations, you've already proven your point. Because here I am, sitting in this strange room, having this conversation with you. That alone shows that no one is truly invincible." The interviewer nodded, acknowledging the validity of Trump's statement. "But there's more to it than that. This experiment isn't just about you, it's about us, all of us. About the ways in which media shapes reality, often without us even realizing it." Trump tilted his head, his interest piqued. "So, let me get this straight. You're saying that everything I've ever done, every decision, every victory, was influenced by something bigger than myself? By the very system you're supposedly trying to study?" "In part, yes," the interviewer replied. "But it's not just about influence. It's about perception. How much of what you believe to be true is based on facts, and how much is shaped by the narratives crafted by others?" Trump chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Narratives are powerful tools, I'll give you that. But at the end of the day, actions speak louder than words. Facts matter more than spin." The interviewer smiled faintly, leaning forward once more. "Do they, though? Consider this. If everyone around you believes a lie, does it become the truth simply because it's accepted as such?" Now Trump frowned, clearly unsettled by the implication. "You're playing a dangerous game, my friend. Manipulating reality isn't just unethical, it's dangerous. People need truth, not illusions." "Perhaps," the interviewer conceded. "But who decides what constitutes truth? Is it the person telling the story, or the audience receiving it?" Trump stared at him, his expression hardening. "I've always believed that truth lies somewhere in the middle. Somewhere between what people say and what they actually do. And if you're looking for proof of that, then look no further than my life." The atmosphere in the room grew heavier as the conversation delved deeper into philosophical territory. Both men seemed locked in their respective roles, one probing relentlessly, the other defending fiercely, but beneath the surface, there was a shared awareness of the stakes involved. Finally, the interviewer broke the silence, his tone softer now but no less intense. "What happens if we discover that truth isn't absolute, that it's malleable, shaped by context and perspective?" Trump sighed, his gaze fixed on the dimly lit screen ahead. "Then we have to accept that our world is far more complex than we'd like to admit. And maybe, just maybe, we all need to start questioning everything. As the minutes passed, the dynamic shifted yet again. No longer was it merely a battle of ideologies. It was a dialogue about the very nature of reality itself. And at the heart of it all stood two men, each grappling with questions neither had answers to. The room seemed to shrink around them, the air thick with unspoken tensions. The interviewer sat back in his chair, his earlier confidence now tinged with a flicker of doubt. For the first time since the interview began, he appeared vulnerable, a stark contrast to the composed figure who had entered the room hours ago. "I was tasked with discrediting you," he admitted finally, breaking the silence that had settled between them. His voice carried no malice, only a quiet resignation. "But somewhere along the way, I started questioning my own role in this game." Trump stared at him, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he leaned forward slightly, his tone measured but curious. "And what exactly changed your mind?" The interviewer hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "At first, it was just another assignment, another story to tell, another angle to explore. But as we delved deeper into these conversations, I realized something important. Maybe I wasn't the one holding all the cards after all." Trump raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "You mean to say that you're not entirely in control of this situation?" "Exactly," the interviewer replied, nodding slowly. "I thought I was the puppet master, pulling strings and shaping narratives. But now I see that I might be nothing more than a pawn in a much larger game, one involving forces far beyond my comprehension." The revelation hung in the air like a challenge, forcing Trump to reconsider everything he thought he knew about the interview. For a moment neither man spoke, each lost in their own thoughts. Then Trump broke the silence, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. "So let me get this straight. You were sent here to discredit me, but instead you ended up questioning yourself? That's quite the twist." "It is," the interviewer conceded, his smile faint but genuine. "And it makes me wonder, if even someone like me, someone trained to manipulate perceptions and craft stories, can lose sight of reality, then what does that say about the rest of us?" Trump leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the dimly lit screen ahead. "It says that we live in a world where truth isn't absolute, it's relative. Where facts can be bent, twisted, or outright ignored depending on whose agenda they serve." The interviewer nodded, his expression thoughtful. "But doesn't that make it even more crucial for us to seek out the truth? To fight against the forces that try to distort it?" Trump chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Fighting distortion is one thing, but defining truth is another. Who gets to decide what's real and what's not? Is it the person telling the story, or the audience receiving it? That's precisely the question we need to ask ourselves," the interviewer replied, his tone growing more serious. "Because if we don't, then we risk becoming complicit in a system that thrives on deception." For several moments, the two men locked eyes, each aware of the weight of the conversation unfolding before them. The dynamic had shifted once again, no longer adversaries. They were now collaborators in a shared quest for understanding. Finally, Trump broke the silence, his voice carrying a rare note of vulnerability. "You know, when I started this journey, I believed I could control the narrative, that I could shape reality itself through sheer force of will. But over time, I've come to realize that reality isn't something you control, it's something you navigate." The interviewer nodded, his expression softening. "And sometimes, navigating reality means accepting that you're not always in charge." The room fell silent as the final words of the interview lingered in the air. The screen ahead remained dark, its blank surface reflecting the unspoken thoughts of both men. Donald Trump stood up slowly, his towering presence filling the space as he adjusted his tie one last time. For a moment he said nothing, choosing instead to study the journalist seated across from him. "You've asked me many questions today," Trump began finally, his voice carrying an unusual note of reflection. "But perhaps the most important question isn't whether I'm telling the truth. It's whether anyone listening even cares anymore." The interviewer looked up, meeting Trump's gaze for what felt like the first time without pretense or agenda. Maybe that's the real danger, not lies themselves, but indifference to them. A world where people stop caring about facts altogether. Trump nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "And yet here we are. still trying to make sense of it all, still searching for answers in a sea of noise. As he turned to leave, the interviewer called out softly, stopping him in his tracks. "Mr. Trump, do you believe there's hope? That we can reclaim some semblance of truth in this age of manipulation?" Trump paused, his back still turned as he considered the question. Then, after a long moment, he responded over his shoulder. "Hope is always there, if you're willing to fight for it. But the battle won't be easy, and the stakes couldn't be higher." With that, he walked toward the door, disappearing into the shadows beyond. The room seemed emptier now, the weight of their conversation lingering like an unseen force. The interviewer sat alone, staring at the blank screen before him. For the first time since the interview began, doubt crept into his mind. Had he truly been the interrogator, or had he become the questioned? Was he the architect of this experiment, or merely another pawn in a game far larger than himself? Outside, the world continued its relentless march forward, oblivious to the quiet drama that had unfolded within those four walls. Yet, somewhere deep inside, the interviewer knew that things would never quite be the same again. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and they wouldn't remain dormant for long. The screen flickered briefly, then went dark once more. In its silence, it seemed to whisper a warning, a reminder that truth was not just something to be sought, but something to be guarded fiercely. Because in a world shaped by narratives and manipulated realities, the line between fact and fiction grew thinner with each passing day. And so, the interview ended, not with answers, but with questions. Questions that lingered long after the credits rolled, haunting the minds of those who dared to listen. As the minutes stretched on, the atmosphere in the room grew quieter, yet somehow more profound. Both men seemed to understand that this wasn't just a conversation, it was a turning point, a moment of clarity in a world often clouded by uncertainty. When the silence finally broke, it was the interviewer who spoke first. "Thank you, Mr. Trump, for reminding me that truth isn't just about winning arguments. It's about seeking answers, even when those answers aren't easy." Trump smiled faintly, his usual bravado replaced by a rare moment of sincerity. "And thank you, for showing me that even the best players can find themselves caught in the web of their own making." With that, the tension dissolved, leaving behind a fragile sense of understanding. As the interview drew to a close, both men knew that the real battle, the one for truth, was far from over. Just when you thought you had all the answers, this interview raises even more questions. Was this just a test, or something far bigger at play? The truth might not be what you expect, and trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. Stay tuned.